I wanted to bring out this evening some of the difficulties that are met with in studying this message of the infinite way, and a couple of questions on the desk fit right into that, and I will read the questions first because our subject will really provide the answers to both of these. We have periods of intense concentration in our study of the infinite way. We listen to tapes daily, read, meditate, and feel very close to our true being. However, after a few months of this, we find our attention drifting away as other things seem to clutter up the view. And we will go through a period when it seems hard to find time for study and meditation, and problems pile up during these lapses. Is this a normal cycle? And the next question, how far can we expect our children to go with us on this path? Now, the first thing is that these questions indicate just what is very common with all students, that the principles of this message are not understood, are not known, and the method of applying them. In the earliest stages of our study, it becomes necessary to learn certain specific principles. In other words, this is not a message of faith healing, nor is it a religious teaching of faith in some kind of an unknown God. This is an unfoldment based on specific principles that have been revealed throughout the years of my own study and meditation and practice. These principles are specific in nature, and no one can hope to benefit by them without first knowing them. Oh, I will make an exception in that when you come to a practitioner for help, it isn't necessary that you know the principles, but it is necessary that the practitioner know them, and the help that you get is in proportion to the practitioner's understanding and demonstration of these principles. And you cannot get any more out of it, out of the study, than you put in. In other words, this is almost, you might call it, a science in its earliest study. At the same time, once these principles are understood and the consciousness is developed to the point of illumination or initiation, whichever word you like best, then there is no more science to it. Then it is a matter of consciousness, a transcendental consciousness, which makes null and void the laws which in our human existence brings about the discords and inharmonies, the ills, the lacks and limitations in life. Let this then be understood. The discords and inharmonies of human life are not primarily your fault or mine. They are the product of a power over which a human has no control until they learn that which will eliminate the causes of the discords of life. It sounds more involved at this moment than it is, but it will clarify itself as we go on. Now, in the years when these laws of sin and disease and lack operated in our consciousness without any ability on our part to do anything about them, we had to take life as it came. If we awakened one morning with a disease, well, there it was. Nothing we could do about it except send for the best available medical aid, and if it had the answer, we were healed, and if it didn't, we weren't. In the same way, when the temptations of false appetites, or what the world calls sins, came to us, we had no way of refuting them, no way of preventing their operation in our experience, and we became victims of them. In the same way, when a country or a state went through some period of depression or lack, it just meant that so many people were unemployed, and you and I were among them, statistically at least, and no one of us would ever have thought that there was any way to prevent it. Business is bad, so many people have been let out, and it's just natural that we're unemployed. It's just natural that we lack. Of course it isn't. There is never any reason for anyone being in lack and limitation except ignorance of how to prevent it or ignorance of what to do about it. In the same way, when these epidemics came around, a flu or polio or consumption or whatever they were, statistically so many people had to get it. And they did. And one never blamed anyone for coming down under the flu. You can't help it, there's an epidemic, but that's not true, you can help it. The only reason you came down was ignorance of how to prevent it. Now, as far as the world is concerned, the world at large is still in that same position, that it has no defense against the evils of this world. But that is not true of those who study a teaching of this nature, because it is safe to say that students who understand these principles are avoiding and always will avoid not less than 80% of all the ills that the rest of the world suffers, and they will avoid probably 99% of the sins. It's an interesting subject for study, and you'd be surprised if you could check on the penal institutions of the United States, the mental hospitals, and find how few people there are in them who have been students of a teaching of this nature. And then you'd see how possible it is to avoid anywhere between 80 and 99% of the world's troubles. But there is a price. It can't be done with blind faith. It can't be done because you belong to something. You can't join a church and become immune, not even a metaphysical one. A certain amount of immunity you can have with the help of practitioners and teachers, but that is limited, and certainly limited in time, because eventually everyone has to be able to go and do likewise. Eventually everyone has to meet most of their own problems. I do believe that just as Christ Jesus found it necessary to ask the help of his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane, so does my experience show that practitioners and teachers, regardless of how far advanced they may be, sometimes find occasion to ask other practitioners or teachers or even their own students for help, because there are times when the hypnotism or mesmerism of events makes it necessary, even for the most advanced, to seek help from someone who isn't at that moment in as much pain or trouble. But this does not change the situation that on the whole, eventually we must all learn to handle our own problems and meet them, at least to a great extent. But how can this be done if there is not an understanding of the principles? Now, that which makes this study difficult is the matter of interpretation. There is no such thing as a literal meaning to the things that are written, either in our writings or any other metaphysical writings, or even in Scripture. There is always a matter of interpretation. If it weren't for that, you wouldn't find 100,000 churches with crucifixes on them and 5,000 different denominations among those with that crucifix. Why do they all have a crucifix on them and still different denominations, different religions, different churches, different groups? Because they are not in agreement as to the interpretation on what constitutes Christianity or what doesn't. And it isn't only in Christianity. I do not know how many sects there are in Buddhism. And in the days of the Master, there were at least a dozen major sects, or very near that, in Judaism. Why? Why, if one is a Hebrew, why are they not a Hebrew? Period. And if one is a Christian, why is one not just a Christian? Why does it have to be a Catholic Christian or Protestant Christian or Episcopal Christian or Baptist Christian? Because of the lack of agreement in the meaning of things. And there is where interpretation comes in. Let me show you what happens even in Scripture, in the teaching of the Master. There are quite a few passages indicating that as ye sow, so shall ye reap. That as ye measure, it will be measured unto you. And that even thought is power. You remember the Master cautioning that it isn't sufficient to refrain from adultery, but even to look upon a woman with desire is the sin. In other words, the thought itself, without even the act, is sin. If you sow to the flesh, you shall reap corruption. If you sow to the Spirit, you will reap life everlasting. And after all of that, in another place, the Master, turning to Pilate, says, "Thou couldst have no power over me unless it came from God. And he says to the blind man, who did sin, this man or his parents? Neither. And to the crippled man, what did hinder you? In other words, in one place, if you think wrong thoughts, and if you sow to the flesh, and if you sow erroneously, you'll reap erroneously. And then when we come upon those who are reaping erroneously, we're told that which caused it had no power. Now, this has been baffling to the religious world as many years as the scriptures have been in print. The church has never been able to understand these statements, never been able to explain them, never been able to demonstrate the meaning of them. Now, you have that same situation in metaphysics. You will read, and it makes no difference which approach to metaphysics you read, you will read in one place that it's your wrong thinking that has brought this upon you, and then you'll read in another place that God is the only power, and God is the only cause. You will read here and there that you must be more loving, or you must be more thoughtful, or you must be more forgiving, you must be more generous. And then another place, God is too pure to behold iniquity, and therefore there is no reality to that which is troubling you. And so when you try to put these together, you find that you really do not have principles with which to work, because you do not know how to bring these conflicting statements into agreement. Now, to understand this principle, let me make it clear to you that there are two realms of consciousness in consideration of these particular statements that I've been quoting. I'm not speaking now of the material realm, because that doesn't enter into it, but there is a mental realm and there is a spiritual realm of life. When you are on the mental realm, and that is the ordinary human realm of living, then it is that as ye sow, so shall ye reap. The thoughts that you think return to you with their own image and likeness. In other words, if you persist in thinking carnal thoughts, mortal thoughts, material thoughts, fear thoughts, that is what you reap. On the other hand, if you are living in a realm in which sin plays little or no part, and false desire, false appetite plays little or no part, and in which you are in obedience, let us say, to the Ten Commandments, then you are supposed to reap good. Now, it doesn't always work out that way, but at least it is a rule. And that is why we have, first of all, the Ten Commandments given by Moses, which constitutes the law. And we are taught that if you live in obedience to those Ten Commandments, you will live harmoniously, joyously, bountifully. If you live in disobedience to those, then you will bring upon yourselves the sins, the diseases, the lack and limitation because of violation of the law of the Ten Commandments. Now, Jesus Christ comes along and he wipes out 9 of those commandments and says, henceforth, you don't have to pay any attention to those at all. I'm going to give you 2 commandments, and if you live up to these 2 commandments, you can forget the other 9. The first commandment, of course, is thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, and then thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Well, now, try, if you can, to think of living a life in which you love the Lord your God supremely. That is, you keep your mind stayed on God. You acknowledge God in all your ways, in which you live and move and have your being in a constant remembrance of God, in a continuous acknowledgement of God in every way, in every facet of your existence, and in addition to this, a life lived in loving thy neighbor as thyself. Now stop for just a few minutes and try to think what kind of a life that would be and what changes you might have to make at this very moment in order to fulfill that, love thy neighbor as thyself. Of course, the first question you would ask is, who is my neighbor? And speaking from the standpoint of Jesus Christ when he says to everyone, your father and my father, it really makes of everyone on the face of the globe a neighbor, and something even closer than a neighbor, a brother and a sister. And remember that we are to treat this entire world as if it was someone else treating us, as we would be done by. And then you can see that you would never have to think any longer about stealing or lying, because certainly you would not wish to be robbed or lied to. And certainly you don't want to be envied, and all the rest of the 9 commandments that we've disposed of. And so your consciousness would be filled with love. Now we are no longer in the human consciousness once we have begun to live by loving the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and loving thy neighbor as thyself. You will find now that you are not having human thoughts. You will find now that you are not having favoritism as to your child or your neighbor's child. You will find now that you are having nothing in your mind in the nature of bigotry, bias, prejudice, jealousy, envy, covetousness. In other words, you wouldn't be a human being anymore. You would be what the Master said we would be, sons of God. If so be the Spirit of God dwell in you, then are you the sons of God. The moment that you begin to pray for your enemies, he said, you are children of God. And therefore, we have these 2 states of consciousness, the mental or human and the spiritual. And while you are in the human, you are under this law of as ye sow, so shall ye reap. And every carnal thought that goes out from you must come back to you. Every hateful thought, every murderous thought, every false desire must come back under that law of Moses. To leave Judaism and to become a Christian, I'm not speaking now of joining a Christian church, I'm speaking now of being a follower of the Master. To do this, it becomes necessary to live perpetually in this love of God and love of neighbor. And then you'll find that you are no longer in this consciousness that is barbing the errors of the flesh, that is attracting to you the image and likeness of your own state of thought. Now, the Master expected that those who followed him would sooner or later rise to that consciousness where they would no longer be human beings, where they would be children of God. You remember this? Call no man on earth your father, for one is your Father which art in heaven. How would you have to live in order to live in the awareness that you had only one Father, one creative principle, and it was purely spirit? And of course you'd have to live in that consciousness of loving the Lord thy God and loving thy neighbor. Now then, first of all, not thinking at all of the metaphysical way of life, but merely the mystical Christian way of life, the very first demand would be to make this transition consciously. Think of the training that involves. Because unless one is miraculously touched with the Spirit of God so that their mortality drops away from them by the grace of God, one would have to train oneself into this new way of living, new way of thinking, new way of being, until it really grew upon them. And this couldn't be done unless you started out with an understanding of these two principles, the law and grace. Living under the law of the Ten Commandments and constantly watching your thinking, or living under grace, which means taking no thought, but watching that you fulfill the two commandments. Now, as you come into a teaching that is not only mystical but metaphysical, you have still other principles to learn. And the reason is this. To become immune to the discords of the human world, even in a goodly measure, not speaking now of total exemption, but even in a goodly measure, requires an illumined, a spiritually illumined consciousness, a consciousness that has been touched to some degree by the Spirit of God, that which in Christian mysticism is called the Christ. When this happens, a transformation takes place, and the person touched is not the person they were before, and they do not live the lives they lived before, and all things are become new. And the reason is that this touch of the Spirit of God acts as a purification. It acts to destroy all potentialities for sin, disease, lack. It wipes out of consciousness, at least in a measure, the earthly, the mortal, the material sense. Now, there are few people in the world who are actually touched by that Spirit without themselves doing something about it. In other words, the finger of God only touches a few to that point of spiritualization or enlightenment. And the rest must build, must study, must practice until that moment of transition takes place. Fortunately, The way has been paved for us, and there are certain principles written down that we can study and practice and eventually come to that point of transition, that point of realization, that point of illumination. But without an understanding of these principles and the steadfastness to practice them, we just go on being the same human beings forever and forever and forever, sometimes being well and sometimes sick, sometimes good and sometimes bad. But to surmount that, it is necessary that consciousness be illumined. Now, to undertake this study in that light leaves no room whatsoever for any periods of, what do we call it, barrenness, except for this. If we are sincerely studying and meditating, let us say for a week or 2 or 3 or 4, there may come a time when for a day or 2 or 3 we are so filled up with what we have read and studied that we have to stop it for a few days and let it settle. We have to turn away from books and get out and live it. Get out in the park, get out at the beach, get out and do something. Get out and turn away from study. It's the same no matter what subject you are studying. Anyone in any study can get stale. And it isn't really being stale at all. It's only that you've taken in all that you can assimilate, and now you have to turn away for a day or 2 and let what you have taken in be assimilated. If you don't do this, it is only because you are allowing yourself to be handled by superstition. If you think that you must have a Bible or a metaphysical book in your hand every day, or if you think that you have to go through the routine of making certain statements or thinking certain thoughts, you are making yourself dependent not on God, but on the books or the statements or the memorizing or the reading. Now the point that comes up is this. If you listen to tapes daily, read and meditate, are you making a god of the tapes or of the books or of the meditation? And if so, stop it and find out that these aren't God. That God is God even when you are not meditating. God is God when you are not reading. God is God if you're out adrift in a boat without a Bible. A Bible is only a book. If you have that book in your consciousness, you have the word of life. You don't need the book also. The book is an instrument, and if you begin to worship it, you've lost your God. If you believe for a moment that you can't get along for a day or 2 or 3 or a month without hearing a tape, you're making a god of a tape. If you feel you have to talk to your practitioner or your teacher every day, you're making a god of them. Well, you'd better break it and learn that God is God if they outlaw all of the practitioners on earth. I have an instance of that this week. We have 2 students in Czechoslovakia, and one of them very, very ill. And the husband had a legitimate reason for going to another country where a cable could be sent to me and a letter. You know, they would both have their heads chopped off if they were caught doing such things, because they can't have these books, they can't read them, and if they were even known to know what's in them, it would be a prison offense. They mustn't even think them. Now, is that depriving them of God? No. because they have truth in their consciousness, and they can rest in the fact that they have learned that God is, and that where I am, God is. The place whereon thou standest is holy ground. These are not statements of truth. This is truth. But if you have to live in the statements all the time, it hasn't become truth to you, and you haven't accepted it. If you have to make declarations, if you have to read it in books, you haven't accepted it. You haven't accepted truth. You haven't accepted God. You have only accepted God when you can stop taking thought for your life. And you can only stop taking thought for your life after you have learned the principles thoroughly enough to know what they are. Now, while you're studying, if you study until you are fed up, until you can't take in any more, be grateful. Be very grateful that you have taken in that much, and then put your books or tapes aside and live in what you have known. Over and over and over, I have said to our students that one statement of truth realized is of more value than memorizing an entire book or knowing the contents of the whole Bible. One statement realized. Why, for years I only knew 2 statements in the Bible and was able to do good healing work too. 2 were quite enough. And I knew a practitioner who only knew 1 statement, really and truly knew 1 statement in Mrs. Eddy's writings, and he was one of the greatest Christian Science practitioners this country, this United States, ever had. All he had to know was 1 statement of truth, but he knew it. He knew it to such an extent that it was his life. And so it is. The purpose of these books and tapes isn't to have anyone make gods of them. These books and tapes reveal this to you. First, that God is, and that God is closer to you than breathing and nearer than hands and feet. The place whereon thou standest is holy ground. And, Son, all that I have is thine. All that the Father hath is thine. All that God is, thou art. There is no separation between thee and thy Father. I and the Father are one. And all that the Father hath is mine. Here where I am. If I mount up to heaven, this is true. But if I make my bed in hell, this is still true. All that God is, I am. All that the Father hath is mine. And if I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for God is even there. Now, as these truths are taken into your consciousness and assimilated, you'll find how quickly the very presence of God will make itself real to you, felt, understood, and God really becomes something of a personal nature. Now, going further than this, in the human scene, we are dealing either on the material or mental level with 2 powers, the powers of good and the powers of evil. And on this human level, you are always using the power of good over error, the power of truth over evil. But as you come into the infinite way, you do not use any powers. Never do you use a power. Never are you called upon to use a power. Because in the spiritual realm, there are no powers to use. There is only one power, and you can't use it, because that power is God. But God can use you. God does use you. God's life is your life. God's mind is your mind. God is living itself as your very life. When you are in the 2 commandments, God is living your life. And you do not use a power to make anything happen, because in the oneness of God power there are no other powers. Therefore there's nothing to use God for or over or against. Only in the human realm, only in the material and mental realms, do you have a power of good that you can sometimes use with which to battle evil. You won't win too often. The world has found that evil wins more often than good. The best way is resist not evil. And that's a quotation, not from Joel Goldsmith or The Infinite Way. That is direct from the book. Resist not evil. Take no thought for your life, what you shall eat. Not use one kind of a thought to overcome another thought. Not use a right thought to overcome a wrong thought. But take no thought. In other words, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And of course, it wouldn't be strange if some of you said, "Oh, do you mean you do nothing?" And of course I don't mean that at all. Unless you think I have been doing nothing here this last half hour. No, you do plenty. You live in the constant consciousness of God's presence, of God's power, of the infinite nature of God's being, of the omnipresence of God where you are. You live constantly and consciously in loving God and in loving thy neighbor as thyself. This isn't doing nothing. This is praying without ceasing. This is living and moving and having your being in divine consciousness. This is leading not unto your own understanding, but acknowledging him in all thy ways. This is keeping the mind stayed on God. This is really living in God. Then you'll find that you are not living in human consciousness where there are two powers. You are living in divine consciousness where the only power is God. And therefore, you have nothing to do but let God live your life. Let God function as your mind, as your wisdom, as your intelligence, as your love, as your life, as your guidance. And in this consciousness, you are living always as if you had your ears opened. And it isn't the outer ear, it's the inner ear. It is the fourth dimensional consciousness in which you are always in a listening attitude, not a thinking, planning, conniving, scheming one, or fearing, doubting one, but in which you are always in this, as if right here, out of earshot, was the Word of God, which is quick and sharp and powerful. And you are always in tune with it, and whenever the occasion requires, it will break through and announce itself, sometimes in words, sometimes in thoughts, most often in deeds. The Word of God is quick and sharp and powerful, but don't ever make the mistake of believing that the Word of God is something that you speak. The Word of God isn't anything that you think or anything that you speak. The Word of God is that which God utters in you. He uttereth his voice, the earth of error melteth. You are always living in this fourth dimensional consciousness as if you were alert to hear. It makes no difference. You may be driving a car, you may be reading the newspaper, you may be doing your housework or out selling merchandise, but always there is a little spot here that's alert and listening, and that listening is one of the highest forms of prayer ever revealed to man. True prayer is not what you think or what you say. True prayer is what you hear, the impartations that come from God to you. Never believe for a moment that God is ever influenced by what you say in prayer, the words you use, or the thoughts you think. God isn't listening to you. You must be listening to God. God isn't taking advice from the human race. God isn't taking an influence from the human race. God isn't moved by the breath of praise. God isn't moved by anything. God is, and all that God is, God has been from everlasting to everlasting. God is unchangeable, and there isn't anyone on the face of the globe, high or low, ever able to influence God, not that much, not on anyone's behalf or for any reason. God is not listening to the human. Why, those of you who have lived through the last 3 wars must certainly know the tens of millions of daily prayers that went up to God to stop wars. And so you know that God isn't listening. Certainly you must know that these millions in the countries where starvation is rife, you must know the amount of words and thoughts that are going up to God for food. And they're still starving and have been for more than 30 years that I know of personally. God doesn't answer because there are no words or thoughts that go up from man to God that are worth the time they take. God is not influenced by man. God does not subject himself to man. God does not mold himself in accord with man's desires. But when man molds himself in accord with God's will, all of the heavens burst forth into that individual's experience. When man subjects himself to God, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done, then I know this, that God is the only power, and that there is no power other than God in the spiritual realm. I know this, that God is too pure to behold iniquity, and in him there is no darkness at all. I know this, that God has never been responsible for anyone's sins, diseases, or deaths, or lacks, or limitations. I know this. But I also know this, that the only way in which I have been able to bring God's grace, God's blessing, God's healing, God's reformation, God's forgiveness into my experience and into the experience of those whom I help, the only way I have of doing it is to be still and listen and let the voice of God reveal the nothingness of everything that appears as a power apart from God. Now, in the human world, material powers and mental powers are very real. But the very moment you touch the fourth dimensional consciousness, these evaporate and disappear, whether it is in the form of infection or contagion, whether it is a form of one thing or another. These things of earth are not power in the presence of God. Now, there is where a lot of misinterpretation comes in on the part of metaphysical and spiritual students. They have read in many of the writings that evil is not power, and they believe it. They believe that evil is not power, and that's not true. Evil is not power in the presence of God. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. In thy presence is fullness of life. And therefore, the entire aim of our work is, through the study and application of these principles that I have been declaring here tonight, by means of this, lifting ourselves into the state of consciousness where God becomes realized, where the presence of God is actualized. Here too, metaphysicians are fooled. They say over and over again, God fills all space. Well, I feel then very much like a man did to me in my earliest years in this work, of saying, brother, you're not well posted. Let me take you down the street and show you a cemetery and a mental institute and a hospital. And that's a stickler. Oh no, on the human plane, you are watching sin, disease, and death eat up this world. You are watching apathy, bias, bigotry, hate eat up this world. How then can you say that it is not power? It isn't power in the presence of God. It isn't power in God consciousness. It isn't power where two or more are gathered together in thy name. There is the matter of interpretation. When you study, when you hear, when you read, remember this. These are only tools that are given to you. They're not God. There's no God in a book. Behind those written words and behind the spoken words on the tape is the consciousness of the author. And it is for this reason that books that have been written by men and women, when in the consciousness, can often bring healing just by reading those passages. Not because of the cold print, not because of the way the words are written, but because the consciousness of the author is in that message. But have you not noticed that it's only occasionally that someone gets healed reading a book or hearing a tape? The actual healings on mass scales take place when you are in the presence of an individual who is God conscious, that is, who has attained or achieved some measure of God realization. In their presence there is healing, just as there was in the presence of Jesus Christ, and for the same reason. The Father within doeth the works. The realized Father within, he doeth the works. And the same way, absent treatment is successful only because when you reach out to a practitioner of spiritual consciousness, even a small measure of it, you have brought yourself into the consciousness of that practitioner. You don't have to stand in their physical presence, because their physical presence is not the healer. It is their attained consciousness, and that consciousness is wherever you are thinking of them. In other words, if you close your eyes right now and think of your home, you have brought that home into your consciousness now, and if your thought is filled with spiritual truth, you are bringing a blessing into your home. You can sit in this room and think of any individual in the world you want to think of and bring healing to them, because they are not as far away as the distance would indicate. They Their true being, which is consciousness, is right here within you. And as long as your consciousness is filled with these truths, they are being healed, or blessed, or forgiven, or reformed, or prospered. It is for this reason that the question comes up over and over and over again: will we sometime be reunited with those who have gone on before us? Sometime? Why sometime? What's the matter with now? You don't have to have their bodies. Bodies aren't worth too much. But you can have them. Bring them alive in your consciousness and you've got them. You've got everything but their physical bodies, and you'll find in a while that you don't need much of that. And you can get along without it entirely once you get used to the idea that you can live and move with your loved ones. You can do it while they're on this plane, if you're at the opposite ends of the earth. And you can live with them if they or you depart this plane. Everything is alive to you that is alive in your consciousness, and everything is dead to you that you permit to die in your consciousness. And when you want to forget someone, they're dead to you even if they're living next door. Don't forget that. When you want them alive in you, they're alive if they're at the other end of the world. Now, all of this takes place in your consciousness. Therefore, the fact that in your earliest studies this isn't easy is natural. It can't be easy. Spiritual truth is so contradictory of everything that is human, mortal or material, that it would be fantastic to believe that anyone is going to make a quick transition in consciousness. Do you know that after the disciples had been with the Master 3 years, they still had so little of this that they fell asleep when he needed them most, that they deserted him when they needed him most? Really, they weren't worth powder to blow up, the whole 12 of them. But the little that they had learned from him in 3 years was a lot so far as the rest of the world was concerned. They undoubtedly brought lots of blessings into the world with as little as they had. And anyone that could be with the Master 3 years and desert him in his moment of need and go to sleep when he most needed their prayers, they didn't have too much. So it is with us. If you think that there's anybody that has much more than a grain of spiritual realization, you're mistaken. This is the work of eternity to work out our spiritual demonstration. This is the work of eternity to attain the fullness of the Godhead bodily. And all that we can be thankful for is that the little that we really have attained can do such mighty, wondrous works as we are witnessing. And we are witnessing wonderful, wonderful works. And I see it with our practitioners. They're doing wonderful, wonderful works with only 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years of study. 10 years. And you know, 10 years out of a person's life in this life is not, well, 1,000 years is nothing in the eyes of God. And so just imagine our few years of study. So let me say this. Really and truly, to come to the place that we're all seeking means to come to a place of spiritual consciousness, initiation or illumination.